Alrighty. So I'll got an agenda today. I'll post it in the chat real quick so everyone has it. And I think we all know each other here. So it's me, Charlie, here to I'm chairing this month's meeting solo. As I mentioned a second ago, Ladrina is out this week, but still glad to have those of us here that are here. And looks like we have some folks still dialing in, but we'll I think we can give them a second. But the plan was to welcome any newcomers, and then we'll have a discussion on some taxonomy. Then I'll share some information about our behavior research, and we could talk a little bit about some ideas on conferences where we'd like to, socialize more of the working group, and then have a little open discussion and wrap up. So for starters, if we have any newcomers, I can't remember if, forgive me if I mispronounce, but Vasileios Mavridis.
Right, that would be me. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Yeah.
Is this, were you at last month's or is this your first meeting? I can't remember.
No, this is my first meeting.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my name is Vasilios, and I'm from the University of Oslo in Norway. And basically, I'm a cybersecurity scientist, and I lead our activities within the University of Oslo pertinent to knowledge engineering for cyber threat intelligence purposes and cybersecurity automation.
Wonderful. Well, welcome. Glad to have you.
Vasilios is very active in the technical committees within OASIS.
Fantastic. Well, hi, as I mentioned earlier, I'm Charlie Frick. I'm one of the chairs for the IOB working group, and we have a little bit smaller crew this month, but I think we have some good things we wanted to talk about. So I wanted to dive in. Last month, we began the discussion on taxonomies for differentiating indicators of attack and indicators of behavior. And Daryl Diebold from IBM has been working on some materials along those lines that we thought would be good to start off sharing. Daryl, do you have everything set up to present?
Yeah, I do.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. Let me see if sharing works for me. Share desktop. Tell me when you guys can see what I see.
I see an OCA Zero Trust working group presentation.
Yes, okay. So what I'm gonna share is really I'm in 3 work groups. I'm in the Zero Trust work group, I'm in the IOB work of indicator behaviors work group, and then I'm in an ontology work group. Here's Zero Trust. Now, why is that relevant? And I may end up joining more work groups when I grow another head. But so these work groups are relevant because the stream of consciousness between all of them in terms of what the problem fundamentally that we're trying to address is incredibly similar in terms of the lines of logic. If I go straight into, you guys are familiar with the NCCOE, National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence?
I am.
So the NCCOE basically has a ZTA, a Zero Trust architecture, and the core components that make up that architecture, really driven around, if you look at the bottom section, users, policies, and then resources, right? And so some things I pointed out to the peers in our ZT group was just some of the possible execution barriers to consider. Now, why would I point out these execution barriers? Because these are symptomatic of fundamental problems or larger symptoms that lead to a core problem, right? So evaluating these symptoms as outcomes and then follow the data back from these symptoms to what's causing them, and then why were those things adopted? Did somebody adopt them? Was it the result of a methodology, a framework? Was it an internal bias shift or something like that. Does any of this make sense, or does anyone have anything to add or remove here? Okay, I'll just fly through this and you guys can Q&A with me after. The categorize and prioritize, what is this? This will make sense in terms of what this has to do with indicator behavior in a minute. This has to do with an optimal deployment of a SIM, but can be applied, I think, to anything from a security-related perspective, right? And you basically start here. This is suboptimal, non-optimal, and then this is optimal. What is optimal here? Well, it's both metrics are maximized. So really, you're getting the most benefit out of the investment you've made. This is where we've been talking, I was bridging the gap with the VT work groups or trust work group around ontology and tautology. Now, what is a tautology? It's an equivalence, right? Saying the same thing two different ways. Like, I am what I am, Popeye says that, or, it is what it is. Right? Those are just basically saying the same thing. And so why does that matter? Well, I believe we're going to move, as we build an ontology, it's going to be taking tautologies between disciplines and functional areas. And what we're following is some of these things that have been applied from a business perspective, from the supply chain, value chain analysis, which is the way the business thinks, inside of this framework largely. And then I will, sorry, one second. Share what my peer Dennis Moreau and I were working on, talking about. He was worked on all this and put it in there. These are the NIST standards as it relates to applying zero trust, but looking at platform and processes, right? And so what's the point of that, right? Sorry about that. The point of that is looking at these standards is really to look at this progression around development. Dennis's emphasis was on really software dev and development. But what we ended up discussing was essentially how these aspects, there are key aspects around, let me see if I can find it. This is probably congeals more around these isomorphs. Now, what is an isomorph? It's basically something that has consistency across multiple approaches, where they're applying policy to an architectural model for execution to achieve that desired outcome, meet the policy requirement, right? And in this case, they're applying zero trust from an accessibility standpoint across 3 CSPs. What's the relevance of this to an IOB? We're trying, as I'm trying to define what an indicator of behavior is, I'm finding that it has to do with this. It has to do with the intersection, not interconnectivity, but an intersection between human system machine activity, or human service machine activity, or user service asset, if you want to say it that way, and that intersection between the three, and then the relevant volume or some other qualitative, quantitative aspect to identify. So that's where we are right now in bridging the gap. There's a linguistic aspect to it. And ironically, in the discussions we've been having, IOB sits a little bit higher. And this will give you a sense of where IOB should end up. We should be identifying things of criticality that are occurring across the government or other institutions in terms of breaches as an indicator early, but it should be relevant in terms of tying it back to mission objectives, or in this case, a business outcome impacting how a business functions. Does that make sense?
I'm tracking what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah. So that's really where we are right now. We're still a work in progress. I'm going to make a lot of edits to this model that he's put in and actually include things as it relates to looking at bridging the gap between the common language use, looking at how do we take the taxonomy used in business and apply it to the taxonomy used in IT, tied to the taxonomy used in security as a sub-discipline within IT. And then how do we elevate, we speak back upstream, how do we take the taxonomy, the identifier, whatever that is, and then take it at its highest point of observability, meaning something that's relevant to everyone. So the granularity could be kept from an esoteric standpoint down at the discipline level, but move upstream. As we're speaking upstream, we talk in terms that everybody can understand, which in this case would be quantifiable risk, relative impact to business workflow. Does that make sense? I don't know if everybody's tracking what I'm saying.
I think I am, but are there other questions from any other group? Well, no pressure to jump in, but if someone does have something they want to ask, please feel free. Okay.
And this may be too much this may be too much to take in all at once, but here's integration with the reference architecture for, obviously, you know who this is. And then the integration automation lifecycles as it relates to NIST RMF. You can see a lot of the different aspects, all of this complexity, everything we've taken is not created, it's borrowed. So we're taking aspects that are being applied today, but this is way too comprehensive. So how do we, this is why we came back to this, is like there are these isomorphs that are occurring deliberately to meet policy that we can then use to bridge the gap between security as a subdiscipline of IT taxonomy back to the business. And this is really a unique opportunity because behavior is special, because if we get this right, then they'll be thinking about security as a business behavior, not as an IT function. So I hopefully that raises some good discussion. That's all I really had today. This is still a work in progress. This is not a final version. It's going to expand and then get flatter again, and then expand and get flatter again, probably a few times.
Okay. Well, no, I appreciate it, Daryl.
Yeah.
As you're doing the revisions, what support can we give you? Do you want us to kind of hold tight for you to get some more things kind of written down and then kind of collaborate on that, or is there
any input? I mean, no, there's no fixed process. So any input you guys have over time, if you just you run across something like, I'm trying to think. I have a million things in my head that I would love to sprinkle in, but I don't know if adding them at this time makes a lot of sense. Like NIST, right? Like basically using AI/ML for code automation. I'd love to include that in this. I just don't know how relevant it is at this point. But if you have ideas like that, I would prefer you default on the side, bias toward action. Just tell me what you're thinking and share with me so that I can at least track it and then put a pin in it and put a highlighter on it so I can follow it. And then if it's relevant, it'll be in the back of my head and I can add it. Because there's going to be this sort of pull of, there's this pull of observation that we have that we don't know where they necessarily fit completely in a finished model. So a lot of this is really, cross-referencing as we discover things between the three taxonomies, business taxonomy, IT taxonomy, security as a subdiscipline taxonomy. And within security, there's different semantic cues for different functions, the jobs, roles, responsibilities. So I'm trying to avoid getting too granular, leave some of that up to discussion, and then keep things at a macro level so the ontology is more straightforward. Because the schema in these ontologies gets very nasty, messy, busy, because they're moving from a connotative model to try to make it relatively denotative, static when they write it down, right? Well, language is dynamic, it's not just fixed. And so is meaning in some cases.
I was going to say, out of what you shared with us today, at least to me, I think the two biggest themes is definitely the isomorphs, that we are looking at the indicator of behaviors to really be able to not just be tied to a single instance of a campaign, but to really capture those meta elements of multiple campaigns that are happening. And so I think that's right on the
Exactly.
money, along with, and yeah, I know you're still working the terminology, but yeah, that intersection, human service machine, I definitely think there's something there. And as we look at the taxonomy, I think it's also a big thing that while we are talking about my opinion at least, is that while we're talking about the adversary's behavior, it's in terms of what the defender is able to see through those lenses. At least that's how I'm seeing it. I don't know if you agree or not.
That's that's accurate. So one of the things that will get exposed very quickly when we get heterogeneity between the taxonomies with some level of parity, equivalence, tautology between these areas, then what will happen as a result of that is that they will see significant identifiable gaps in quantified risk. So, you know, the old adage, I don't know what I don't know. If I don't know it, it can't hurt me. But in a digital world, that's a lie.
Yeah.
It's a complete lie, because if I don't know what it is, but I'm using it, it can absolutely hurt me. And so that delta in risk is, I think, where this is going to, because we'll be finally speaking a language the business can understand, tying it back to services they're consuming, and can show them the relevance of that tied to, from a business workflow standpoint, those dependencies on, you know, 10,000 units per hour need to be coming out of this plant, tied back to these IT services that support it at an MRP level. You can see where that's going. And if any of these things are disintermediated, obstructed, or discontinued, that affects revenue directly. And then in discrete manufacturing, that has a ripple forward effect, meaning work planning, scheduling, staging, because they can't recover the lost time. And so they have to make concessions. They don't just lose the money they would have gotten from the goods going out the door at the scheduled time, but they also end up compensating those people that they failed to deliver those goods or services to at the appropriate time, contracted time. So that becomes money, real money that's quantifiable.
Absolutely. I definitely think as we step forward, the overlap with the risk community is going to become really apparent. As we gotta get this.
Yeah, I think it's right now. Yeah, and I think we'll be talking their language. Today, risk audit really follows a, I don't know if it's path of least resistance, but they do to some extent path of least resistance from a business workflow standpoint, and they don't, the lowest common denominator, right? They're checking boxes. And there's just significant areas of risk that they're blind to.
Agreed.
So,
okay.
Hopefully this is helpful.
No, I think this is a good start. I mean, that's the whole point. We wanted to start getting more content into these calls. And I think, you know, feel free to coordinate through the mailing list if people have things they want to submit, or feel free to reach out to me or Daryl directly. I think our emails are on the charter. So, but we'll be happy to help field questions. And if anyone sends an inquiry straight to Oasis, Dee knows how to track us both down pretty quickly. So, but thank you, Daryl.
Thanks, Charlie. Thank you, sir.
Sure thing. Alrighty. So I'm going to share my screen now in a moment, and I'd like to share with everybody some research that we've been doing here at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. In the US, that's the main civilian agency in charge of cybersecurity, as well as security for all of our critical infrastructure. And they've been supporting us for many years. And one of those areas that we've been researching is machine readable representations of adversary behavior. And one thing I'm really happy to announce is as of today, as of a few days ago now, we've gotten public release of a reference implementation of some of our work. We're currently working with Oasis to get that posted up onto the GitHub to make that easily accessible to everybody. And we'll definitely be sending links and words out once that's loaded up. But today, I thought I'd give a little presentation that talks through what's in that reference implementation. One thing I want to stress is I'm going to be, just due to the nature of release review, this is a overview of what I'm calling revision 0 of our behavior object. It's really where we were at the end of December 2021. We're continuing to develop and add some new features and capabilities. And now that we've gotten the first revision publicly released, we are looking to share updates on a regular basis. Not sure if we'll be able to keep it every quarter, but we're going to try and have updated versions with additional features rolled in. But I thought it'd be good to show an example of the type of objects that we're developing. And so I'll get right into that now. And feel free to interrupt. Once I'm sharing the screen, I won't be able to see hands raised. So please feel free to just interrupt me if you do have a question. Otherwise, I'll try and go through this with enough time for Q&A at the end. And apologies, it is a little dense, but I think it might be, for this crowd, it might be some interesting material. So hopefully everybody can see the screen. Should be seeing a kind of machine readable cyber adversary behavior objects.
Yep.
Excellent. All right, then I'll dive right into it. So let me get into the motivation for why we began all this work. We here at the lab have been doing this for a few years now. And this kind of came out of an earlier effort. Saw Michael Herring here. He was one of the key sponsors of the Integrated Adaptive Cyber Defense project, IACD. And kind of one of our, so welcome, Michael. One of our motivating factors here was that we saw our network defenders are struggling to use cyber threat intelligence when they're trying to address the speed and scale of cyber defense. And so we felt that there was a need to improve the use of security automation and to improve the use of machine-to-machine threat information sharing, because those two together really form an ecosystem that I think you have to have in order to match speed and scale. And a big reason why we are so happy to be working with Oasis is STIX, we find, is, especially STIX 2.1, is a very useful standard for packaging up the data. But sharing the context sometimes gets lost as people pass the objects in between various platforms or interpret it. And that context is really critical. And it's what we see the automation and the vendors products needing in order to help enable the network defenders. But it really is those kind of different communities. You have the people building the tools that the vast majority of the world are going to just use, that want to automatically process this data. You have your network defenders that are trying to implement threat intel into their operations directly. And we also have the threat intel analyst committee. And each one of those kind of views the data through a slightly different lens. And we need a way, kind of similar to what Daryl was saying, we need a way to have a common language and a somewhat common format for passing along these insights. And MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE DEFEND are two fantastic and necessary capabilities. But we argue, and when I talk with folks at MITRE, they would agree, they're extremely necessary, but not sufficient. MITRE ATT&CK represents the tactics and techniques. But when you really want to talk about adversary behaviors, for any particular single MITRE ATT&CK element, there can be multiple procedures. And we want to look at commonalities between those procedures, because that's what's going to generate the observable actions on a defender network that could be used to detect adversary activity and ideally eventually trigger response activities. And so you really need that information. And we want something essentially a little bit more general than an indicator of compromise, because for those of us familiar with defending against IOCs, can be very tactically useful data, but with a very, very short shelf life. So we want something that can live longer than that, but we need something a little bit more specific than just an attack entry. So like I said, attack will show you what type of data to look for, but not really how to look for the specific procedures. And defend gives you a lot of context on what one can detect, but it's not currently, at least, very easily consumable. So we're trying to look at a solution that could help bridge this gap. So at the very highest level, when talking about these sets of behaviors, we want to have machine readable behaviors and behavior sets. The idea being this little chain right here. A machine opens a suspicious email. That machine runs PowerShell for the first time. That machine has a specific part of the registry modified, and a system level process sends suspicious traffic. Any single one of those are 4 behaviors making up a behavior set. Any one of those behaviors can have detections with a fairly significant false positive. But if you correlate them, they tend to represent some sort of bad activity happening. And that's the whole goal, is to help capture the sequence and capture the logic for how to detect and correlate your detections. And that's what we're going for. But to get to that, I need to go a little bit of history of our research. I promise not to drone on too long. But we started looking at how we wanted to make this something that could be easily consumable by a machine so that it can be presented to a human. And sticks has been the most useful option for us, especially within version 2 and particularly 2.1. There's the way to represent your threat intel on sticks as what they call a bundle. And essentially that's a knowledge graph. And that allows for analytics and automation to really capture the relationship between the intel objects being shared, which we would argue is the most critical aspect if you're really looking to share something that's going to live beyond a single campaign. And so kind of a little mini version of the pyramid of pain there. But procedures, sequence of the procedures, they span the behaviors and the detections, but they don't fit perfectly well. So I want to show kind of in a graphical format how we would look to represent behaviors. So this is a don't worry about not necessarily being able to read all the cues. Hopefully you can see the key and the different colors for the blobs. But this is a graph database using Neo4j to represent a sticks bundle known as an adversary playbook. This is for a particular ATP known as APT, known as Muddy Water. And adversary playbooks are a research idea out of Palo Alto's Unit 42. We find them to be extremely useful examples of how to use the sticks bundle to capture the multiple information in the relationships. And I've lost my cursor. So essentially, what you'll see there is the green blob is the playbook for Muddy Water. Within there, you'll have the orange blobs for reports. The little tan blobs up top are multiple campaigns. And within a campaign, you'll see those blue blobs kind of arcing through there. Those are attack patterns. Those map directly to MITRE attack elements. And in the existing adversary playbook, you then have a whole bunch of those little red dots, which are your indicators of compromise. And right now, often with indicators of compromise, those are IP addresses, file hashes, domains, or CVE, and some linked to CVEs. And so basically you come down to block the indicator, patch the CVE, but that's all very reactive. And those indicators, anybody that actually has had to block indicators knows, especially IP addresses, they tend to not be active in attacks for extremely long periods of time. And often by the time you get them out of a threat feed, the bad guy has stopped using that information. So they have various amounts of tactical value. So we wanted to see how we could change that around a little. So like I said, all those red dots are indicators. What we want to instead is let's look at what's happening between the sequences of those attack patterns. And that's where you can see a certain behavior that is common amongst multiple procedures that this actor is using and similar actors use. And the goal there, and so like I said, this is from about 2 years ago, what got us to start this work, is that you can find multiple behaviors that are part of a sequence. And if we were to build a reliable sequence for some activities like spear phishing, then we can start flipping this graph upside down and now see multiple playbooks, multiple campaigns that share that common set of behaviors. And the reason we want to do that is now, instead of having to constantly update for every new indicator, for every new instance of every campaign, we really focus our defense activities on the behavior and the set instead of on all those indicators. And the idea being, then we would tie that to detections and mitigations. Very kind of breakneck overview, but that's where we were in 2020. And that led us to say, let's try building this out. So let's fast forward to January of 2021, where we initially started was a very, very simple prototype. We began thinking about how would we build 6 objects for these type of elements. And that led us to really seeing that we would need behaviors, behavior relationships, and detections. Sounds simple, but it took a while to see what we would want and how we'd want to package it. And then we focused through a lot of the year on how to fit these into STIX 2.1 bundles and show that they could be shareable and extracted and processed by different levels of automation. That's led us really to where I got with this reference implementation that we've just gotten released. Is it's a simple prototype, simple. It's about 900 lines of JSON, which I know is terribly exciting for anybody to read. But what we did is, in our test environment, we stood up a small enterprise environment test bed where we integrated in a few different things. We were feeding mostly sysmon and network logs to a SIEM to test out our analytics, but we've also installed some automation for user emulation. So the workstations in our environment are constantly writing emails to each other, creating Office documents, visiting websites. We did all that so that we could generate background noise in the SIEM as we investigated some analytics to detect the various malicious behaviors. At the same time, we stood up a emulated adversary, pretty simple Cobalt Strike license and C2 server, and based a campaign off a real event, APT-37, also known as Reaper. Reaper was a North Korean campaign that spearphished users with a macro-enabled Office document that then established a foothold, allowed the attacker to escalate privileges. They then stole additional accounts to elevate privileges, and then went across the network to steal data. We've repeated that in our environment. And in this first example of the behaviors, we've represented a few chains of the sequence. So I think it's a little easier to show you. So in the this is the initial revision 0 bundle, and this is a view in the STIX visualizer, which is a great product, but I'm going to swap this view for a moment just so we can take a little closer view to what data we're actually sticking inside these little blobs in the network graph, in the knowledge graph. So just for our research, we tend to be big fans, or at least I am, and I've made my team be fans of Neo4j graph databases. STIX translates pretty easily into that format, but it allows us a way to showcase more of the data living inside these blobs. So, and I'm going to simplify this view to go in more detail in just a moment, but I thought I'd talk you through some of the objects that we're seeing here. So at the center, that kind of teal green circle, that is a STIX object known as a grouping. And that's what we're using right now to represent our behavior set, that the grouping is going to connect to a bunch of additional behavior objects, as well as their observables and detections and correlation information. And also I'll say in the newer revisions, we've also allowed the grouping to map to the referenced attack pattern objects as well. And when we get to revision 1, those will be included. But the grouping is what we use to define the behavior set. Within there, we have an identity. In this early work, we still have the old IACD name, and the reference implementation is called demo. But you know, we're gonna have an identity for the actor that creates the behavior set, as well as any extension definitions that are needed for information that's being passed in this bundle. So trying to stay compliant with the STIC standard, we have those bits of information. However, I want to move some of that off and just focus on a subset of the graph, because this will allow us to really talk about kind of the first couple steps of that attack campaign. And so this is some data we have for representing the spear phishing of a user, the macro executing additional code to launch a command shell, and a modification of the registry to establish persistence. Each of the blue dots represents that behavior. The green are observables tied to that, kind of us showing our homework for what leads us to create the red objects, which are detections, and the pink, which will be a correlation object. And I'll go into more detail on those right now. So in the actual behavior object, just by itself, just that one dot, doesn't have all the knowledge that you'd want. The key relationships are what you need to be able to extract. But we want to include the links back to the MITRE attack pattern that this is a child of. It is feasible that there could be certain behaviors that would represent multiple elements in the attack matrix. I'm not super often are we seeing that, but I'm just saying in the realm of the possible. But we keep reference to what attack entry that this is behavior is a child of. And that allows us to then see that next level of detail. So this would be spear phishing and office macro spear phishing link behavior. Within there, there's a chain of process observables explaining the type of, basically the chain, for this case, the chain of new process creations that we can observe. A lot of this is from data that we see in Microsoft Sysmon. I'm going to get myself in trouble, but I think it's event 4688. But we wanted to really just explain when this happens, we'll see a process that is, say, an email application launch, spawning a new process that is a web browser that with a command line entry that is a Office extension ending in a docm or pptm or xlsxm, then spawning a new DLL or exe file. And that by following the parent-child relationships, that sequence tends to represent this type of activity happening. Now, with that comes, we don't expect most consumers are going to be reading through all the observables and crafting their analytics. So we also are looking to include in the red objects detection analytics. I'll show an example in a moment, but right now we're describing the process of what is launching, what type of application is spawning a new one, and how to search for that. And here we're looking, I said, a lot in Sysmon event 4688, and we're going to use we're using right now a language called Sigma to kind of show those analytics in generic format. And I'll explain that in a moment. Something that's been in heavy discussion is the use of OCA's Kestrel threat hunting language, which is something we're actively working on as well. The point being, these detection objects allow you to hold more than one analytic. So a lot of this was just looking for the right packaging of how to pass this data. So this is an example of a Sigma rule for finding a Office, an MS Office file, a macro-enabled MS Office file being opened and downloaded from the web browser. And the reason we liked Sigma is stressing again, Sigma itself is not a seam, for those not familiar with it. But Sigma is a common format for the seam rules. And so from that red blob, normally this would be done by automation or a couple lines of Python, but we're just kind of showing it visually here that you can extract that Sigma rule as a kind of embedded JSON in the bundle, automatically translate that to YAML language, which is the native format for Sigma. It's a little bit more human readable there. So you can see that it's telling you that you're going to look for a creator process of Outlook, Thunderbird, or Mail from event 4688 that's creating a new process of Edge, Chrome, or Firefox. So this means when someone clicks on the link in your email program and it opens a web browser. Now that by itself, as I said way earlier, millions of false positives for that. But we'll get towards that in a moment, where correlating this with other activity is where you'll get the value. But what's nice again with Sigma is open source, and there are built-in translators so that a recipient can automatically translate that Sigma rule into the query of their choice. So just for an example showing, this is taking that same rule and automatically it can be processed to create a Splunk query, Elastic query, an Azure Sentinel rule. And there's about 12 or so other major themes that are all included in there. But that's kind of why we were starting with Sigma. As we look to how to incorporate Kestrel analytics as well, Kestrel utilizes Stick Shifter, which also does a ton of translations to the various themes on the market, following the right data models. So we're just showing this way to share detection analytics in a somewhat vendor agnostic way amongst the community, so that when we share the behaviors, we also share how to look for them. And now in the Rev 0, the big important thing is correlating all these detections. I will confess that what we had in December, it's an extremely trivial, really placeholder detection right now. We call it a detection group. And the first example was just saying, count out, go execute all those detections for common, time frame and computer hosts and see how many return. Not what we're really envisioning. What we've been working in our current research is starting off with using business process modeling notation to represent a correlation workflow. And we'll be embedding that in the object. Longer term view is to also look at utilizing Cacao to see if we could share the correlation logic as a Cacao workflow. But we do think that sharing a workflow of how to correlate these will be a good first step to get us towards where eventually you could create automation to process these incoming bundles, automatically translate your alerts, and automatically correlate them. But this is where it is at this exact moment in time. And pardon me, I've got to, let's see if I can get my cursor back. There we go. So there's a lot to unpack with what I just said. Like I said, ideally we'll be sharing out the link, because along with that 900-line JSON, I've got a 50-page technical report, though 25 pages of it is a copy of the JSON in the appendix. But you got about a couple dozen pages to really kind of explain the details of what we've just built and where we're looking to take it. But we do have this out there, and we're looking to keep building onto it and like to expand. And it looks like Vasilios has a question, please.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. It was insightful. I'm not sure if I have interpreted everything correctly, but my question is, if I'm not mistaken, what you propose, among many things, is that you want to introduce a new sticks domain object, let's say, that is called behavior or something. But my question is that the indicator object, which is a level object right now, it's not really specified as an indicator of compromise or indicator of attack or indicator of behavior. It's just called indicator, and it can embed right now Sigma rules, and it's not difficult also to add Kestrel rules. So I'm not sure that I understand what this effort is going to offer in addition.
I understand. That was one of the first things we were looking at too. So thank you for the question. So when part of the reason why it took us so long to kind of come across this approach, we were looking at using custom extensions into the indicator object for the behaviors. But one of the problems we were seeing is was frankly a heavy repetition happening because of kind of when we're looking at the procedure of how indicators are being tied to campaigns, that we really saw that you'd have to keep adding, you'd have to use products to really insert the same data many times over for multiple indicators with a lot of the current model, just with the way that a lot of tools are currently existing on how they're processing the indicator object. So that led us to going for the idea of building the custom object. That said, a big part of us wanting to share with this group is to help refine this reference implementation to make a presentation towards the sticks TC. And I do expect that this won't be the last time we have the debate on how to represent it. But what we were finding was that we had some we weren't finding as much, we were finding a potential risk of having to greatly duplicate the amount of behaviors represented in sticks bundles if we were using them as extensions to the indicator object, or run the risk of the processing of indicator objects by a lot of tools removing that data and not knowing what to do when that information is in certain indicators but not in others. And so that was one of the reasons why we were going this route. It is early in the research. I mean, as far as this is our first really kind of forum to share what we were doing, but that was our motivation on why we made a custom object rather than extensions to the indicator SDO. I don't know if that helps but that's what led us to kind of take the approach that we just did. And perfectly fine to disagree with the approach. I just wanted to explain where we were coming from.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. I mean, are you going to share at some point this technical report? You said that you have a
yes, sir.
Mm.
Yeah, I've been actually in talks with Oasis right now on getting this loaded up to the OCA GitHub. So I got the public release approval last week, and we've just been trying to work the coordination to get it loaded up there, and then we'll email out the link. I can coordinate with Dee also if there's some other routes where I can just email it to the IOB mailing list. I can start with that as well. But happy to get the information out there. Just thought it'd be good to get it on the if I get on the GitHub. I thought that would be a good place to have it, to give a common ground for everybody to reach that's easily accessible. But absolutely, be happy to give you, and I'm also happy to give you a copy directly.
Thanks, I'd be happy.
Sure thing. Now I'm just trying to, again, get my cursor back to, there we go. Stop sharing and give up the screen. So are there any other, comments, questions, concerns regarding to that, or any other topics that folks would like to bring up with respect to the working group? We have about 7 minutes left in our time today, and wanted to make sure I opened the floor up. Okay. All righty. So then I will, and I also, forgive me, I skipped one part of our agenda. D, one thing that I know we talked about last month and wanted to bring up again was the idea on conferences. I know, as we said last month, but just to reiterate, I do think that not necessarily, I'm definitely happy to share our work here from the labs as well as the taxonomy work, but we definitely think borderless cyber should have some IOB working group components to it. And we just kind of reiterating our enthusiastic support as the planning for that comes. We'd be glad to, I'll be glad to provide whatever support OASIS needs to help plan that out. If you have any inroads, I don't know if Jane is still the key organizer for the conference or not.
Right. Yeah, she is. We're just trying to figure out between these other conferences exactly how we want to land and scheduling. I mean, obviously it's not going to be the summertime. If anything, it would be later in the fall, which seems to be kind of our sweet spot. The OCA is having a BOF at RSA. I will be circulating more information on that as soon as we get, it will be on that Wednesday at RSA. Is anybody considering attending RSA that's on the call? Because we'd love to have you there.
Yeah. Unfortunately, right now, I don't think RSA is in the cards for me this year.
Okay.
I got the ticket a couple of years. I got the ticket a couple of years ago, and the lab rotates.
The rotate. Okay, I gotcha. I gotcha. Well, we haven't firmed up the topics either, but I'm sure that, we'll have some questions about IOB, but that's sort of the next thing. And if everyone has not registered for the OCA briefing with Fran Howarth, who is an analyst from Bloor on the 16th of March, just bear with me 1 second. I'll put that in my, in the chat. Where is that link? Let me just see. Oh my goodness. I've got too many windows open.
Fair enough.
Just, it's coming. It's coming.
While we wait for that, the other thing I just wanted to say was, I know we're working on a few conference submissions on our research for this year. And as I put those in, I'll be planning to put in a plug for the IOB working group with the links to the OCA site, as well as information on how to join the mailing list and the Slack. I think that's one of the best ways to get things together. And there is the Zoom invite in the chat for everybody.
Charlie, do you know which events you're?
I will get back to you once we have some finalization, but we are actively narrowing the list down.
Okay.
Obviously, we're not speaking at RSA since the call for papers ended, I think, in October or November of last year.
Right. Yeah. And OASIS, I mean, OCA may have a slot that we're still in maybe land. So.
Understood. So hopefully by next month I can give you a better list of the ones that we're targeting. And if I have that sooner, I'll reach out to you directly via email.
Okay, that'd be great.
See what we coordinate. But yeah, definitely want to plug the working group and OCA in general as we talk about this topic.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
So anything else?
Yeah, that's everything I had on the agenda I sent out. I don't know if anybody else has anything they'd like to say or ask, and happy to stick around longer if someone has a question they'd like to ask directly.
Charles, this is Carter. I'm sorry I came in really late, and so
not a problem.
I'm gonna ask a really stupid question because I
go for it.
Came in so late. So in the last slide, you talked about adversarial behaviors.
Yes.
And in my work, I've realized that a lot of behaviors that really contribute to this aren't anything. They're like, this guy sent too many bytes, or this guy talked to too many people. Totally innocuous, doesn't have any context, nothing that you can, unless you have other indicators to put them together. So yep. I'm interested in, if you could just give me a 10-second little blurb about other kinds of behaviors other than adversarial that you're interested in.
So when I talk about right now, I'll say my research, this is kind of why we also started with, and sorry you came in late, but why we're all starting with Daryl on some of the taxonomy, that we do think the working group's going to need a combination of representations of adversarial behaviors as well as what was it? I'm going to pull up my notes real quick. The kind of intersection on human service and machine activities to look for activities that go across all those aspects.
Yep.
But so I think when you get to non-adversarial behavior stuff, you're really going to get more into the almost more into the risk side of the equation for the impact of certain
Right.
things.
That's
When it comes to
absolutely right.
when it comes to detection, I think that plays a lot on response and mitigation and how we prioritize and deploy that. And I think that's a major area for looking at use of automation responsibly and how we build up the trust in that. So,
Well, remember things like phishing detection is really a combination of basic stupid behaviors that come together,
Yeah.
right? So my interest is to understand the basic stupid behaviors and to see how we can assemble them into like MITRE attack categorizations and things like that. So if you guys are interested in that kind of stuff, I'd really like to get together.
I'd love
to talk
to
about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Cool.
So, and this is a great venue to interact, right?
Yeah, that's what we've liked it so much is open to the public, no cost of admission. And yeah, and forgive me, Carter, which org are you with?
Org. So I have my own
Organization.
company, Quotient. I've just done a lot of work with NSA and DOE, DOD. So, but
Okay.
yeah, but I kind of like behavior, so put it into lots of different things. And so it's really interesting to see that you guys have come as far as you had. So I'm really interested in how far you want to go.
Excellent. I just threw my email in the chat in case you didn't have it from the other invites, but I'm happy to coordinate some time to discuss that in more detail.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Then in that case, I will thank you all for attending.